Hello and welcome to the Financial Puzzle Playbook with your host, Jim Sumpter. I'm RJ Malik, producer of this podcast. And on our last podcast, we touched on the six puzzle pieces. Jim, I think a good thing to do is to review the six puzzle pieces because that's very important to how you do business. So I think that would be a good way to start it off. And then we'll break it down. We'll talk about cash flow.
RJ, that sounds great. So today you just mentioned today's focus is going to be all about cash flow, and that is every financial plan starts with the puzzle piece of cash flow, and then the others that we touch on are investments, insurance, income taxes, estate, and retirement. And so today we might touch on each of those, but primarily today's episode we're going to talk about cash flow, what it means, how to start it, how to manage it, and really just kind of go from there. And I thought one of the first things that you always have to do is you have to know what's coming in and what's coming out. And so it's an exercise that we talk to people about in the very beginning is because I'll ask people, I'll say, well, how much do you make? And the answer I always get is how much hits their checking account. Well, that's not exactly how much you make. And
Right.
so sometimes we have to go back and take a step and talk about gross income versus net income. We're going to touch on those sorts of things, but I wanted to, before we delve into this whole cash flow concept, I want to make sure that the audience realizes this same principle is consistent whether you're a 22-year-old getting your first job, or you're a 65-year-old retiring, or you're a 72-year-old that is, taking income and living life. And so I talk about three very distinct stages of wealth. And the first is wealth accumulation. That's going to be in your younger years. You're making money, you're saving money, you're trying to accumulate money for a future date. Then we get into wealth preservation, and this is going to be maybe from your mid 40s to early 50s. The kids are getting out of college, hopefully getting off the payroll, and so you're preserving what you have, still accumulating before you get ready to retire. And then we get into what we call the wealth distribution phase. And that's where you're no longer getting a paycheck from your company, or if you own your business from your business, but you're starting to distribute some of your wealth. But every topic that we're talking about today and every concept fits into all three of those buckets. And so, when we talk to people at whatever stage in life you are, we say, what is your budget? And that's one of the very first steps, is talking about the budget. You're in a stage in life. So RJ, which of those would you fit into? The accumulation, the preservation, or the distribution?
Um, uh, I'm still accumulating, but
Okay.
we're heading into preservation,
Okay.
you
Okay.
know,
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah. Yeah. You're,
because we
you're, you're trying to save everything you can.
right. And
You're
we
trying to preserve what you have,
and
and
we've
and you're not ready to start distributing quite yet.
no, and we've got some bills that have popped up that we weren't expecting,
Yeah.
and we have to take care of them.
Okay.
And
So we're going to talk about that very thing that you just mentioned, the bills that pop up that you weren't expecting. Is what can you do at 22 years old, 23 years old, to make sure that when those sorts of things happen, you have that. It's interesting, one of the conversations I have with a lot of people is they're just starting out, and they're like, well, why do I need to save for retirement? That makes absolutely no sense. I need to pay off this. I need to pay off this. I want a car. I want to do all these things. Why do I need to save for retirement? So I'm going to take a step back. So Jim is 22 years old. Jim has just graduated from college and gotten his first big boy job. Okay. Now my first job was at the bank. And you know what? I've told this story before. When I got my job at the bank, I was going to be a banker. So that meant I was going to be rich. I was going to play a lot of golf, and I was going to have banker's hours. And absolutely zero of those happened. And so I get my first paycheck. And at that point in time, I was actually married my senior year in college. So my first big boy job, I'm a 2-income household. So I get my first paycheck at the bank, and I'm kind of like Clark Griswold in the Christmas Vacation when he gets the jelly of the month certificate instead of his bonus.
Yes.
I kind of tilted my head, and it was a little bit less than what I had expected.
Right.
And so I'm looking at my paycheck going, okay. Okay, that was a little different. So I call my dad, and we've talked about my dad on previous episodes.
Mhm.
He was my confidant. So I called my dad and I said, "Hey, Dad," I said, "Who the hell is FICA, and why are they taking my money?" And he said,
Yes.
he did kind of like you did. He laughed, and then he said, "Well, son, that's your Social Security." And I said, "Well, what does that mean?" Now, keep in mind, I am a college graduate.
Right.
I have gotten my first big boy job. I have gotten my first paycheck, and I am a banker. I should know these things. But FICA, which is Social Security and Medicare, what a lot of people don't realize takes 7.65% of every dollar that you make, and it pays into Social Security and Medicare. So let's think about that. If you make $100, for every $100, $7.65 goes away. The other thing that goes away is your taxes, or your federal taxes, your state taxes, and we're going to talk about this on a future episode of how to fill out that W-4 and what company benefits mean. I've got some ideas on doing those. So we're not going to focus on that today, but let's just say when you're dealing with cash flow, you have to look at your gross income. Okay. So that means how much is the company actually paying me? They're paying me X number of dollars of salary, or I'm getting paid X number of dollars times the number of hours that I worked. And that's my gross income. So we take a look at the gross, we subtract out the taxes, and we subtract out Social Security and Medicare. And we call that your net. Okay. That's the number we want to start budgeting from. Now, when we're talking about budgeting, that's not necessarily the amount of money that hits your checking account. Because if you pay your health insurance, if you pay any other benefits, if you put money into your 401k or your 403b or any other retirement plan that you may have, those come out before it hits your checking account. But when we're talking about budgeting, we want to take your gross income minus your taxes minus your Social Security and Medicare. Okay. That's our starting point. Then we want to use a rule that I kind of like to talk about, and a lot of financial planners use this rule. We call it a 50-30-20 rule. It means we want to spend 50% of our money on things that we need. We want to spend 30% of our money on things that we want. And we're going to talk about the difference between a need and a want. And then we're going to spend 20% of our money on savings. Okay. So that's a general rule, 50-30-20. Okay. So what is a need? Well, if you ask, we've talked about my kids. Sometimes if you ask Cassidy, my 19-year-old Cassidy, do you need that? The answer is absolutely. And I'll sometimes say, do you need that or do you want that? Okay. And we're going to talk about subscription services in a minute. And,
Yes.
Netflix is not a need. Netflix is a want,
Yes.
when we go through that. But let's take a step back. Let's talk about needs. Okay. These are the things you can't live without. I have a rent payment. I have a mortgage payment. I need to pay medical insurance. I need to pay deductibles. I've got to buy food. Now, let's say food at the grocery store, not food at the restaurants. We'll touch on that. I've got a power bill, I've got a gas bill, I've got a sewer bill, I've got a phone bill. A cell phone used to be a want. In today's world, I would argue that a cell phone is probably a need.
Yes, absolutely.
In my job, I can't sign on to my computer without doing two-factor authentications and all this kind of
Right.
stuff. So it's absolutely a need for me in
Everything is on
what I
my
do.
phone as far as passwords and things
Yeah,
like that to
yeah,
all different sites. It's
yeah.
all on my phone.
100%. So, now we may not need all the extra data plans and all this other kind of stuff that comes with it, but the general consensus of needing a cell phone, I would put that into the need category. Okay.
Mhm.
So, the other thing that happens a lot of times when we graduate from college, we have student loans. And we're going to spend an entire episode on student loans coming up at some point, but let's just say that we've got a student loan bill. Then we have this thing called a car payment sometimes. So, you know, um, I was introduced to the whole car payment thing back when I graduated from college. I had a car, my parents, and then when I wanted to buy my car, I all of a sudden got introduced to what a car payment looks like. And so sometimes you might have a car payment. Now, there is very much of a difference between a car that you need and a car that you want. And sometimes we have to budget for what that payment looks like. Again, future episodes, but for today, let's just suffice it to say you may have a car payment, and that's a need because you have to have transportation of some sort, unless you live in an area where you have public transportation and you don't have a need for a car, but you have that cost of the public transportation. So those can certainly be interchanged amount. Another need is if you have any credit card debt, you have to pay the minimum credit card payments. Now that doesn't mean that you have to go pay all the extra, but you have to pay at least the minimum. We have insurances, things like that. Those are our needs. So 50% of what we spend in our budget, and let's go back to the budget thing. When we take our gross pay minus taxes, minus Social Security. That's our starting point. That's where we're starting to budget from. And then we do 50% to our needs. Okay. Now let's talk about some wants. Eating out. I will tell you that 90% of the time when I talk to a new client or an existing client or a child, or myself, even a lot of times, I look at my eating out bill. And, a couple of years ago, you could go to Chick-fil-A and you could get a number one combo, which is my go-to, with a sweet tea. A number one combo with a sweet tea is a chicken sandwich, fries, and a sweet tea. And it might cost me $6.
Right.
Today, it's going to
Mm.
cost me 11. So all of a sudden, that number one combo at Chick-fil-A just cost me $5 more. Well, if my wants budget is 30%, did I increase my salary to start with, or did my costs just go up? And that's something we have to look at. So in financial planning, I always talk about that when you put a financial plan together, it's not something that we do one time, we put on a shelf and we say that was a fun exercise. We have to monitor it ongoing. This budget part right here, this cash flow part, is an ongoing monitoring process. Talk about eating out. Let's talk about subscription services. Now, this is probably the second most costly want that we don't really think about. Is, by the time you add, a handful of dollars for Disney, you add Netflix, you have Hulu, you have Spotify, you have Apple, you have your gym membership, you have all of these different subscription services. Those all of a sudden start really, really, really adding up. So you have to look and say, what is important to me? What do I really want? Because this is our want category. Then there's things like vacations, hobbies. I'm going to put, sometimes I'll get the question about, well, where do I put my pets? in this whole scenario? Well, I will tell you, in my house, my pets are like our kids. So I would put that into the need category because they need to go to the vet. They need food. They, occasionally will have to go to the vet because they get sick. They need the heartworm medicine. Little things like that, if we don't budget for those, all of a sudden they start adding up big time. And we have to look at it and say, you know, how do I pay for that? Do I pay for that by adding to a credit card, which we don't want to do? Or am I pulling from my emergency fund, which we're going to get to in just a second? And so these two big categories, I'm going to go back to the beginning when I said, when you're setting up a budget, I want you to write down everything that you spend in a month. And let's break it up even more simple than that. Today, if you start on a Sunday, write down everything that you spend from Sunday to Saturday night. That's a week. And I think a lot of times people would be surprised at, what do I really spend? Wow. How much did Starbucks really cost me?
Right.
What's so my go-to at Starbucks is an upside down caramel macchiato.
Okay.
It's one of the things that I know how to say. I don't speak a lot of Starbucks language, but I do know how to speak that one. And then I still go back to, well, what's the difference between, large, medium, and small? Well, that's tall, grande, or venti. And I have learned that there is a cost difference between grande, which is medium, and venti, which is large. And is that a need, or is that a want? If I need to have Starbucks, do I need the venti, or do
Probably
I want
not.
the venti?
Yeah.
And so these are the little things that you can do when you're setting up your budget, because what happens is when we overspend on our needs or we overspend on our wants, where do we get that from? Is we get that from our savings. And that's where I call it budget creep. That's where budget creep starts coming from. And so if we go back to the 50-30-20 rule, 50% is need, 30% is want, well, 20% is savings. Okay. This is where we pay ourselves first. And sometimes if we work for a company and they have like a 401k, okay, you may put, let's say, 5 or 10% of your salary into your 401k. Well, that's a portion of your 20%. So let's use the number of 10%. So let's say, I make $1,000. I'm putting 10% into my 401k. So I'm putting $100 into my 401k. Well, that's 10%. Where does that other 10% go? Well, that's where we talk about emergency fund. And so when we start talking about emergency fund, you say, yeah, that's really cool. That's my savings account that I got at the bank. But what does that really look like? Again, as a financial planner, I have two schools of thought. If you are married or in a relationship where you have two incomes, you need to have 3 months worth of your expenses that are saved into an emergency fund. If you are single, you need to have 6 months worth of expenses that are saved into an emergency fund. Then we're going to take that a step further, and we're going to break that up into what I call a 3-tier cash reserve. Okay. What does that mean? Now, this is not getting rich money. This is money that we're setting aside in the event of, RJ, you mentioned a few minutes ago, you had some bills that crept in.
Right.
This is where this emergency fund comes in. Okay. Literally this week, I had to put front brakes on my car.
Right.
And what I learned is that, that's not a cheap endeavor. And because you got to do brakes, and then you have to align, and then you got to get new rotors, and you got to do all this stuff. So all of a sudden, it's a several $100 bill. Well, how do I pay for that? Well, I can go charge it on my credit card, but now I've got this credit card debt out there, or I can take it from my emergency fund. So we had it set up. I took it from the emergency fund, and that made a lot of sense. So what does an emergency fund look like? So if I have, my wife and I both work. So if we have 3 months set aside in of our spending in our emergency fund, and the reason you do the 3 months if you have a 2 income household is because the chances of both of you losing that income are less. And again, these are minimums, okay, but it's less chance than one of you losing the income. So you would need to have 3 months set aside. So again, let me go back. 3-tier cash reserve. So tier 1, that's your savings account at your bank. You're not making any money on it, but it's a way you can go in, you can immediately move it with your phone, and you can move $1,000 from the savings account to the checking account, and you can pay the bill. Okay, that's your tier 1. You're not making much interest, but it's there and it's available. Think about that as kind of the 1 month, as kind of a number for that. Tier 2, this is where high yield savings accounts comes in. So, we all get bombarded with these, Facebook ads or TV ads, or we get things in the mail, or we get things sent to us on our email about high yield savings accounts. And quite honestly, right now they're about 5%, which is a pretty good rate of return. Now, 2 years ago, that high yield savings account might have been 1.25 or 1.5. And so, you're not always going to get the 5%, but it's going to be a better percentage than what your local bank is going to pay you in just a regular savings account. So that's tier 2. And think about that. That needs to be money that you can get within 3 to 4 days. Maybe you move it over your phone. Maybe you have to have them initiate the transfer, but it's not an immediate transfer. It's money that you can get within 3 or 4 days. Tier 3, and this is where a lot of times we'll use an investment account, where we will use very short-term investments, but it's getting a little bit more rate of interest than high yield savings account, and it may take us 3 to 4 days. So let's use a couple. Let's say that they're making, I'm going to do easy math I can do in my head. Let's say a couple is making $100,000, okay, and let's say that they spend $5,000 a month. So 3 months, if it's a couple, so they want to have, $15,000 set aside into their savings account. So you say, well, Jim, why would you do a 3-tier cash reserve? Well, when's the last time you wrote a $15,000 check that you needed immediately? Now, some people may have an answer for that, but others may not. And they're like, well, in my example of my breaks, I needed money that I could get right away, within a day, within a few hours, actually, that I could turn around and pay. So I used my tier 1 cash reserves, and then I will build that back up in my tier 1. I didn't touch my tier 2 or my tier 3. Madison, in CMC Financial, the M, so my middle child, she is buying a house. And so her mom and I are helping her out on some of her down payment for her house. So that money, and I had a little bit of a warning on this that we were going to be helping her out. I was able to use some of my tier 3 money to do that with, but it still came from that emergency fund. Okay, so now we're building that back up. Now, other people may have set aside another bucket of money to help with a home or something, helping the kids or something like that. So you may not have used your emergency fund. In our particular case, we did, and we'll build that back up in a period of time. But that's how the 3-tier cash reserve sort of works. So RJ, I've been talking for a little bit, and
That's
you've
okay.
been very intently listening.
It's great information.
Does all of this sort of make sense? And what do you think what questions would the listeners have after hearing all of this?
Well, it makes perfect sense. I guess the question that I would have is, 50, 30, 20, boy, you got to be really disciplined because
Right.
as you were talking about 50, 30, 20, I'm even thinking right now, I don't
Hmm.
think I could do that with some of the expenses. But you have to be honest with yourself, and I would have to be honest. There are things that I want that I probably could get rid of because I
Right.
don't really need them.
Right.
And we're sort of, and actually, my wife and I are sort of going through this with our TV, all the TV apps that we have, and
All
which
the
ones do we,
subscription services.
yeah, which ones do we really need?
Right. Right.
And we go back and forth on it, and I'll say, well, do we need this app? Yeah, because my favorite show of this is on. Oh, okay, it's one show, I get it. So you have to be, and you have to be honest, and then you have to take a step back. It's $4.99 a month for that app. Is it really going to save you a lot of money? I mean, so it's you sort of really have to do a deep dive into your expenses.
You
And I
you know
think what
you
you'll find, and as you were talking, and I'm going through my expenses in my head, yeah, there's a lot of waste that I can get rid of before we get into stuff that I know my wife wants, or that I need. And you're sort of inspiring me to go into my bank account and look at the stuff. That the killer is the repeating um, fees that come out automatically, because you don't have to click a button to pay every month.
That's
It's,
right.
like your credit cards, I don't have an automatic pay. So I see my credit cards every month. So I know how much I'm spending. I'm good with that. But at the same time, there are expenses on the credit card that I know I got to get rid of.
Right.
You just inspired one person to look at his budget again.
Well, and I have to take a step back myself and do this exercise, and and I'm trying to talk to the listeners about financial planning. This is the way a financial planner thinks, and in the same way, if you go to a doctor for the first time, they're going to give you this, several pages of tell me your history. Well, this is the history of your finances, and in a snapshot in time of where you are now. A lot of financial planning is a mindset. You were talking about the 4.99 subscription.
Yeah.
Well, that could also be the difference between a small coffee and a large coffee,
Right.
or in Starbucks world, a tall coffee and a venti coffee.
Right.
That could
Right.
be the difference between taking a sandwich from home versus going to get a number one at Chick-fil-A.
Right.
Because if I really want to have that subscription one time of month, fine. That's a want, and if that fits into your want budget, that's perfectly fine to do that. But what else are you willing to give up throughout the month in order to do that? And that's where we see a lot of people get into trouble, is because what happens, remember my budget creep. Budget creep means you creep from one area into another area. And if we creep from a need into a want, and then a want into savings, at the end of the day, how much do we have in savings? Well, we're putting money into our 401k, because that comes out of sight, out of mind. It doesn't show up in your checkbook. But then our emergency savings is down to basically zilch. And then if all of a sudden you need to have the brakes put on the car, what do? And you panic and go, oh my gosh, where am I going to get this money from? So then it goes to the credit card. So now we get this credit card. So it's sort of this habitual cycle. And we see that so much. So that's one of the things we try to talk to clients about from the beginning. Now, is this an easy exercise? Absolutely not. Is this something that we're going to do overnight? Absolutely not. Are we going to make changes overnight? Absolutely not. But are we going to have the conversation about it? And sometimes it may take us 2 to 3 to 4 to 6 months before we really start understanding, okay, this is where my budget creep is coming from. because your other option is go make more money. Go get a
Yes.
second job, go ask for a raise. You can't decrease your taxes. Well, we'll talk about tax strategies at some point. So there are ways to do it, but there's things that you've got to pay for that we just don't really think about a lot of times.
Right.
And that's what I wanted to talk about on this whole cash flow thing, just to kind of get it out there. It is the beginning of every single financial plan that we do. Because if we don't get our head wrapped around this, the rest of financial planning doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Because we have to get our head wrapped around this. Because if we're going to make changes or adjustments and make adjustments in our financial plan, if it doesn't affect our cash flow, it's not going to matter.
Right.
It's truly not. And so that's why I wanted to start with this. I think it's a great place to start. It's what we start at CMC Financial when we sit down with a new client or a client that we've worked with for 25 years. We're still talking about these things. Remember, this is all three phases: wealth accumulation, wealth preservation, and wealth distribution. Every single one. You have to have your budget.
Yes.
You have to know what's coming in and what's going out.
Because budgets change.
100%.
And from year to year, your budgets change, things come up, and you have to figure out how to make sure you don't, as you called it, the creep. All of a sudden you're looking around and it's like, geez, my expenditures have gone up 25% this year or 30% this year.
Yeah.
How did that happen?
Yeah. Or what about inflation? We've all seen the effects of inflation over the last couple of years. Yeah. Again, something totally beyond our control. That number one combo at Chick-fil-A is now costing me more.
Right.
That subscription, I know we have a Disney Plus subscription because the girls like that. Okay.
Yeah, sure.
So when Disney Plus first started out, I think it was like $4 or $5.99.
Yeah.
Well, if I'm correct, I think I'm right on this. Now it's in $12, $13.
Exactly. Yes. No, you are right.
Yes. So if you do that 3 or 4 or 5 times throughout the month, all of a sudden, you've added some real money. If you've been out to eat, and so as inflation happens, many times we have to adjust our budget. But it all goes back to this whole cash flow and this budgeting category, and that's why I wanted to spend a little bit of time on it.
Well,
focus on that today.
It's a great topic, and after we get done with this, or I'm going to go over my budget again. You got my head spinning, Jim. So you accomplished at least one thing today. You got my head spinning, and my wife will thank you for that. So
it's usually the other way around. Usually the wife will spend and the husband thanks me for that.
Yeah, no, it's going to be me this time. But I think we switch on and off. So, sometimes I have to talk to her about it, but
as long as you're not both on at the same time, that's
right.
That's where you really get in trouble. That's right.
Jim, is there anything else you want to cover, because we're wrapping things up here?
No, I think that's what I wanted to cover in this episode. And in future episodes, we're going to delve into some of these things a lot deeper as we start going into this.
Sure.
But this is a 30,000 foot view of how we look at cash flow, which again is that first financial puzzle piece that we always talk about.
Very good. How can people contact you, Jim?
Yeah, so there's a few ways. Our website, www.cmcfp.com, has all of our contact information. My direct phone is 205-510-9074. You can text me on that number. We're on Facebook. We're on Instagram. We're on LinkedIn. You can find us at CMC Financial on any of those platforms as well.
Excellent. All right. Thank you, Jim. And most importantly, thank you for listening to the Financial Puzzle Playbook podcast. We ask you to share this podcast, rate it, and leave a review, because this actually helps others find the show. Again, thank you for listening, and for everyone at the Financial Puzzle Playbook. I'm RJ Malik, and we'll see you at the next podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Financial Puzzle Playbook. Click the follow button to be notified when new episodes become available. Don't forget to follow us on social media by checking the links in the description. And contact us today by visiting our website at www.cmcfp.com or give us a call at 205-510-9074. Content here is for illustrative purposes and general information only. It is not legal, tax, or individualized financial advice, nor is it a recommendation to buy, sell, or hold any specific security, or engage in any specific trading strategy. Results will vary. Past performance is no indication of future results or success. Market conditions change continuously. This commentary reflects the personal opinions, viewpoints, and analyses of CMC Financial. It does not necessarily represent those of RFG Advisory, Private Client Services, their clients, or their employees. This commentary should not be regarded as a description of advisory services provided by CMC Financial or RFG Advisory, or performance returns of any client. The views reflected in the commentary are subject to change at any time without notice. Securities offered by registered representatives of Private Client Services, member FINRA SIPC. Advisory services offered by investment advisory representatives of RFG Advisory, a registered investment advisor. Private Client Services, CMC Financial, and RFG Advisory are unaffiliated entities. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where RFG Advisory and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. No advisory services may be rendered by RFG Advisory unless a client agreement is in place.